Liberalism has failed. The liberal paradigm, which began during the Enlightenment, is collapsing. We are at the end of a great civilizational cycle. Another dark age is upon us. But out of this darkness will emerge afresh the doctrine of nature, and new barbarians to revitalize the West and direct it towards a new destiny. The fundamental failure of liberalism is that it does not address the problem of nature, and it moreover conceals it with the idea of natural rights when no such thing exists. Failing to recognize and account for the fundamental laws of nature and concealing them with idealistic human laws is one of the most fatal errors a civilization can make. The Greeks devoted much of their philosophy to the relationship between Physis, nature, and Nomos, law. Yet the idea of nature, the discovery of nature, is quite rare throughout human history. In Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, Costin Alamariu argues that the idea of nature emerges out of a, quote, refinement, abstraction, or radicalization of the aristocratic way of life and of the principle that underlies aristocratic life and the aristocratic worldview, end quote. He writes, when the idea of nature emerged, it did so in opposition to convention or custom. Cows graze, wolves hunt by nature, but different tribes of people deal differently with the dead, cremation, burial, etc., by custom or convention. It is a notion which is distinctly similar to our nature versus nurture, or nature versus culture, or nature versus social construct. The question of what was by nature or by convention animated much of Greek intellectual life and had important political meaning, for example, with the aristocratic party generally favoring the side of nature and the democratic party generally favoring the side of convention. In the first chapter, I try to explain how the rudimentary idea of nature could have emerged out of the primitive or prehistoric mind, out of the mind as ruled exclusively by ancestral convention or custom. The answer is that it could not. The momentous discovery of nature, which is the precondition of both philosophy and science, is the preserve of one very unusual people, the ancient Greeks, and long thereafter, those parts of Europe where Hellenic civilization was promoted, first by Rome and later in a considerably modified form in Christianity, and various Christian states that had inherited some of the Roman institutions, end quote. Costin argues that the idea of nature emerged in the late stages of Greek aristocracy as a response to the aristocracy's many critics, as a solidification and abstraction of the aristocratic worldview. But we then must ask the origins of the aristocratic worldview. As we have talked about at length on this channel, the first aristocracies were formed out of nomadic, pastoralist peoples conquering sedentary, farmer populations, and imposing their hierarchies and worldview upon them. This means that the aristocratic worldview and the first seeds of the idea of nature were born among pastoralist peoples, as Costin goes on to argue. While the sedentary, tribal life of the farmer is ruled by convention and custom, and he is therefore unable to separate what behaviors he has inherited through custom or religion, and which through biology and nature, a nomadic tribe would have been able to observe a great many peoples and their differing ways of life. This would allow them to observe which behaviors remain consistent across the species, and to formulate a rudimentary idea of human nature. Further, the harsh conditions of the nomadic way of life, which relied upon the breeding of strong herds to live off of, and later the domestication and breeding of horses, would have made ideas of nature and biology especially important to pastoralist peoples. Darwin's natural selection would have been self-evident. Only the strong and the fittest specimens survive the harsh life of the steppe, and sexual selection would have been just as evident. If the fittest specimens are bred, they will improve the quality of the herd over time, and even lead to behavioral alterations, like the domestication of horses. The separation between nature and law, Physis and Nomos, can be found implicitly as far back as Homer, when Achilles says to Hector in the Iliad, "There are no pacts between lions and men, no peace between wolves and sheep." Recognizing that he is about to die, Hector asks Achilles to allow him to be buried honorably in accordance with the customs and laws of man. But Achilles rejects this offer, appealing instead to the laws of nature, which are absolute and final. There are no laws, no peace treaties, no pacts, no mercy in nature. In the later stages of Greek culture, the dichotomy between nature and law becomes more explicit, as the aristocracy who claimed the divine right to rule based upon their descent from gods and heroes, and therefore upon their natural superiority, sought to defend itself against democracy, the rule by custom and law alone. We only have fragments of the sophist Antiphon, but they give us a great insight into how the aristocratic faction in Athens thought. He writes, quote, "Justice, then, is not to transgress that which is the law of the city in which one is a citizen. A man, therefore, can best conduct himself in harmony with justice if, when in the company of witnesses, he upholds the laws, and when alone without witnesses, he upholds the edicts of nature. For the edicts of the laws are imposed artificially, but those of nature are compulsory, and the edicts of the laws are arrived at by consent, not by natural growth, whereas those of nature are not a matter of consent." End quote. Just as Achilles did, Antiphon argues that the laws of nature reign supreme, while the laws of men are constructed and only exist within the polis, the city, within civilization. The edicts of nature, the laws which govern life, which govern biology, are compulsory and exist regardless of consent. In Athens, Greek tragedy marked the transition from aristocracy to democracy. In the plays which survive, there is a constant struggle between law and nature, between the blood feuds of the divine lineages of the Bronze Age and the justice and law of the city. And Euripides, the last of the three great Greek tragedians, and a good friend of Socrates, openly ridicules aristocratic ideas of the gods and nature, although in his final play, the Bacchae, he actually seems to recognize the supremacy of nature in the form of Dionysus. The democratic movement in Athens criticized ideas of both nature and the divine because the two ideas were closely associated for the Greeks. The aristocracies claimed the right to rule not just by their natural superiority, but because of their divine descent from ancient heroes, as was the case with the Heraclids, who claimed descent from Heracles. And aside from the pagan gods of Greece being intimately connected with the forces of nature, the primary focus of Hellenic religion was the miraculous rebirth of life out of death, celebrated in the mystery cults. The seasonal rebirth of plant life and the generational rebirth of animal and human life through reproduction presented for the Greeks the common nature shared by all biological life, the very miracle of life itself. At the very center of Hellenic culture was the idea of nature. Now that we understand the origins of the idea of nature, we have to delve into the origins of liberalism. Among the Jews, an anti-aristocratic revolution also took place in the form of Christianity. The religion of the Israelites at the time was organized around purity laws and laws of marriage and reproduction. And since Jesus was born out of wedlock, he would have likely been considered a mamzer, impure, and been treated as an outcast. Jesus advocated for the abolition of these purity laws, baptism for all, communion with God for all. There shall be no Greek and no Jew. Therefore he democratized the religion of the Israelites. The Gospels of Paul and John implicitly attack the Greek mystery rites, saying that the body, bios, life, is just a dying vessel, and that true, eternal life is found in the spirit and the afterlife. The Christianity of Jesus and the Gospels was a refutation against nature. It claimed that the laws of nature are not in fact compulsory. You can simply refuse to consent to them. This is the ascetic doctrine. But the laws of God and heaven are eternal. Your body will die, but your soul will live forever. Therefore, clan, tribe, offspring do not matter. They are arbitrary divisions. All that matters is the relationship of an individual with God and the individual's soul. This is the foundation of liberalism. However, we still need to go through a few detours to arrive at the doctrine of liberalism. In Europe, the pagan idea of nature and the natural and divine right to rule continued on even after Europe's Christianization. Thus, in Europe, the Christian God, who originally stood outside of nature, apart from nature, and opposed to nature, was conflated with nature. The laws of God are the laws of nature, for the world was created by God and proceeds from him. This is a pagan idea, not a Christian one, and it is here that the fundamental fallacy of liberalism arose. The conflation of nature and the divine makes sense in Hellenic paganism, since the Greeks did not consider either the gods or the laws of nature to be moral or idealized, but rather viewed them as cruel and savage, albeit beautiful. But since the Christian God is a moral God, when God and nature were conflated in the European Christian tradition, the laws of nature had to become moral laws, unless God was proven to be immoral. In the European tradition, the pagan ideas of the divine right to rule and the conflation of nature with the divine continued on without interruption until the Reformation, when the original Christian idea that the only thing that matters is the individual soul and their relationship with God returned. The Reformation and the Enlightenment dissolved the idea of the divine right to rule and therefore of the legitimacy of aristocracy. But the conflation of nature with God continued into the Enlightenment, when liberalism was born. At the core of liberalism is the idea that the purpose of a state is to protect the natural rights of a people. The United States Constitution is founded upon the idea that it is an individual's natural right, given by God, to be free, to defend himself, etc. The problem is that these rights, like all the laws of men, are artificially constructed and are not actually found anywhere in nature. As Achilles knew, in nature, rights and freedoms can only be won by force. They are not guaranteed, and in society they are arrived at by the consent of your fellow men and by the state. The state, just as easily as your neighbor, can disregard your natural rights, because, as Antiphon said, the edicts of the laws are imposed artificially. Liberalism claims that artificially constructed human laws and customs, so-called natural rights, are absolute and found self-evidently in nature, when nature in fact contradicts these laws. The worst thing one can do, if one is seeking to found a society which will last, is to found it upon an ideology which ignores the basic facts of nature. By the 20th century, liberalism had already begun to fail due to its own inherent contradictions. The idea of nature, not clouded by morality or law, was rediscovered in the late 19th century with Darwin, Nietzsche, and other writers who were essentially rediscovering what the Greeks had already known. The laws of man are artificially imposed upon nature, but nature cares only for survival, breeding, reproduction, and the struggle to survive and to dominate. Fascist Germany took this realization to an extreme which had only previously been seen among the Spartans, a total erasure of individualism in service of the tribe, and the implementation of eugenics to breed a stronger tribe. It was only due to the post-war reaction to fascism and then to communism that liberalism managed to survive the rediscovery of the ancient idea of nature. But now it seems that liberalism is truly on its last legs, This is because liberalism depended on the Christian social order, which guaranteed the common consensus of man in order to operate. Today, the liberal, like the Christian, has discovered that nature, which he relied upon as the foundation of his moral and political thought, in fact contradicts those very things which he claims are natural and self-evidently ordained by God. To point out the most obvious one, it is by no means self-evident that all men are created equal. In fact, the opposite is clearly the case. The rule of nature is inequality. All civilizations which we have known eventually collapsed because they, like the walls which defended them, were artificial structures which resisted nature. Civilizations, like walls, eventually crumble and return to the state of nature. But a civilization which is built upon the denial of the fundamental facts of nature and of human nature, which is built upon a falsified view of nature, is especially dangerous. The prosperity of our civilization has allowed us to hold nature at bay for so long that we have become disconnected from the fundamental facts of life, and we are paving the way for nature to return with a vengeance. In America, the left has strayed so far from nature that they routinely deny the existence of basic biological facts, such as the existence of biological genders and gender differences. When they cannot deny the existence of biology and nature, they attack it and seek to eradicate it. They have taken the liberal principle of the freedom and happiness of the individual and the Christian principle of the freedom of the individual from the constraints of biology and nature to an extreme. And to resist the left, liberal conservatives, who make up the majority of the American and European right, can only appeal to a diminishing Christian social consensus, since they cannot appeal to nature. I believe that liberalism will soon be completely destroyed as Western societies become increasingly unstable and the harsh realities of nature set in. Individuals are more committed to their ethnic and religious tribes than to any abstract ideas of government, citizenship, or individual liberty, and human rights are a privilege which are in no way self-evident or guaranteed. Inequality is a fact of life, and moreover, inequality is the precondition of biological life and the mechanism of its most basic functions, the organization of cells into an organism and the generational adaptation of that organism through unequal survival and reproductive outcomes. Most of all, we will come to realize that those who ignore the principles of nature, both individually and on a societal level, are punished harshly. To seek to rebuke nature, to seek to escape biology and negate the laws which govern life and nature is hubris, and those who attempt it are inevitably struck down. Yet the death of liberalism paves the way for the rediscovery of the doctrine of nature. When everyone around you fundamentally misunderstands the very principles of reality, there is no greater tool, no greater weapon that you can have than to study the laws of nature and biology. From diet and the gymnasium to the nature of competition and inequality, having a basic understanding of nature will give you an edge over everyone around you. And perhaps, just as it happened so long ago, while the masses of man have their vision clouded by the doctrines of morality and custom, a new caste of nomadic peoples who see clearly the principles of nature will install themselves as the new ruling caste, the supermen of the new age, just like the heroes of the Bronze Age once did. This, my brothers, is the path forward. Strengthen yourselves, prepare yourselves, for there is still destiny in your eyes. And when you feel that civilization is crumbling all around you, become the barbarians at the gates.